Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Different Solution, Solar PV Without the Upfront Cost. My name is Quentin Merritt. I'm a member of the Low Carbon Communities team here at Cumbria Action for Sustainability. I'm very pleased to say that we're joined today by our guest speaker, Steve Lawler from Baywind Energy Cooperative. I'll let Steve introduce himself properly when I hand over to him in a few minutes. I'm going to begin the webinar by saying a few words about community energy. Then I'll hand over to Steve, who will explain how Baywind can help organizations install solar panels. If you think of any questions while we're speaking, I would be very grateful if you could write them in the Q&A box, the question and answer box, as we go along, and then we'll come to them at the end of the presentations and try and answer those and have a bit of a discussion. Two other points to mention before we begin. The webinar should last no more than 45 minutes, so we should end by 1:45 p.m. And second, as mentioned on our website, the webinar is being recorded so that we can share it via the CAF's YouTube channel. I'm just checking the Q&As. I see there's a few comments. Hi, Steph from Lancaster Priory. Yeah, Wendy, you say you can only see the screen share, not any people. I think that's because we're in a webinar mode and there'll be too many people to see both the slides and the people at the same time. So it's set so that you can see the slides but not the speakers, or not all the participants. Okay, let's move on. So, just to set the scene a little bit, this year's seen a huge increase in energy prices, and everyone's looking for ways in which they can cut their energy bills. There's also growing awareness of the climate crisis, and individuals and organizations are all wanting to do their bit to reduce their emissions for that reason. One obvious solution to some of this is to invest in renewable energy, and there's been a huge surge in interest both from individuals and organizations wanting to install solar panels. This obviously comes at a cost, sometimes quite a high cost, and with finances being tight, not everyone can afford to do that. There have been some funding schemes, such as the Low Carbon Lake District grants, but these run out quickly, and the one I've just mentioned is closed at the moment. So the question then is, how can you benefit from low-cost electricity from solar panels without the upfront cost? And can you get someone else to pay for them for you? I'm going to come back to that question shortly, but I'd like to say a few words about community energy in general first. So, community energy, what is it? There are lots of different definitions of community energy. They're mostly pretty similar. This one comes from the Community Energy England website. Some of the key points of community energy for me are that it can involve both renewable energy generation and also energy efficiency and energy conservation projects. It can involve different renewable energy technologies such as wind, solar, hydro, heat pumps, biomass and tidal. And different kinds of community involvement. For example, communities can be involved in funding and in ownership. They can be involved in managing projects, and they can be involved as consumers of the electricity generated. Oh, I've gone forward a slide. I don't know how it happened. I beg your pardon. Right, that was meant to be on there. Sorry about that. Just to give you two examples of community energy schemes, and some of you might recognize the photos here. The one on the left is a hydro scheme, 30 kilowatt hydro scheme at Killington Reservoir in South Lakeland. And that's a scheme that is operated and was set up by Community Energy Cumbria. And the image on the right shows solar panels on the roofs of James Cropper PLC in Burneside, just outside Kendal. That's a 1 megawatt scheme, and that scheme is owned and run by a community group called Burneside Community Energy, which sells the electricity to James Cropper PLC for use in their factory. I would have given you a wind turbine example too, but I think Steve will probably mention wind when we get to his presentation. Okay, so now the benefits. Lots of different benefits associated with community energy. They tend to vary from case to case. They generally include reduced carbon emissions and cost savings. I've listed others on this slide, and the picture on this slide incidentally shows a the installation of a ground source heat pump, which uses boreholes at a social housing development in Blackburn, which I actually visited yesterday, which was very interesting. I'm not going to go through all the examples on this slide, but the one I will draw attention to is what I've called the ripple effect. And the idea here is that each time a highly visible community or renewable energy project appears on the landscape, it helps to redefine what people see as normal, especially when people see a whole range of different kinds of organization doing it, such as a business, a church, a school, a community group, or a sports club, and so on. These different types of organization all have different kinds of different audiences, and therefore tend to influence somewhat different groups, although the groups overlap. I don't have any evidence to back this up, but I suspect that the combined influence of diverse energy projects is greater than the sum of their individual parts. Okay, enough from me and enough on community energy. It's time to move over to our guest speaker, Steve from Baywind. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Quentin. Thanks for the introduction. Apologies, everyone, for the state of my voice. I'm on the recovery side of a rather heavy cold, but I hope everyone can hear what I have to say. A brief history of Baywind to start. In 1995, a group of us interested in renewable energy met in Barrow with a plan to set up what would become the first community-owned and run wind farm in the UK. So over the next 3 years, we set up the cooperative, and we sought and gained planning permission for development of five medium-sized wind turbines on a site called Harlock Hill, which is just above Ulverston. We raised nearly £2 million through public share offers, and this was sufficient to enable us to develop the site. And with the spare that was left over, we also bought in to another existing wind farm, small one down at Haverick. So for nearly 20 years, we ran this site, producing electricity from wind and gaining a small return for our members. And this amounted to roughly 5% per annum on average. Then in the mid-2010s, another company came in and developed 3 much larger turbines just above our site. And we took the decision at the time to repower the Harlock Hill site by selling the 5 small turbines and building 2 new bigger ones of the same size as the 3 above us. We ran this for another couple of years, and then we sold the whole site to a company that's now become Baywind Energy Cooperative. And in 2020, we sold our remaining turbine at Haverick. So we now had a lot of cash, and the original remit had been that we would, back in the 1990s, that we would operate the site for 25 years and then sell all the turbines and give the money back to shareholders. Well, while we'd done the first part of that, a decision was taken at an AGM to keep the money and reinvest it in other forms of energy production. And with the disfavour that land-based wind turbines were then viewed, particularly by national government, but also by local authorities, it was decided that we would explore other ways of producing energy, and rooftop solar is an obvious solution to that. But we've not discounted the possibility of a small hydro scheme if that turns out to be a possibility. Since that decision, Baywind has installed 8 rooftop solar schemes in the Furness area and 1 in Kendal. And details of these, for anyone interested, can be seen on the Baywind website. They are quite small schemes, And what with COVID limiting income to the hosts and relatively higher maintenance and repair costs, they've not produced the return that we would have liked for our members. We're now looking for bigger schemes, preferably well over 20 kilowatt peak, which represents, to those not familiar with this, about 60 to 65 higher power panels, each of about 1.5 meters by 1 meter, and that translates into a roof area of roughly 90 to 100 square meters. So anyone interested would approach us with a suitable roof, could approach us, and we will take a look at that roof to see what its orientation is, and particularly its condition. The potential host has to be the owner of the roof, or at least have full permission from the owners to develop solar panels on it. We ask for some initial information, which is the MPAN, which is the meter point administration number of the building's supply, and we ask for consumption data, and those give us an initial feel to whether a possible scheme is developable on this site. Obviously, it's best if consumption of electricity is during the day, because that's when panels are going to produce, but it can be extended to the evening and early morning as well. If the site looks possible, we then ask a solar contractor to come in and give us an estimate of realistically how many panels could be put on to that roof, and whether in the first place the roof is capable of accepting them. We then prepare what's known as a draft power purchase agreement, which essentially designs the scheme in terms of the number of panels to the ability of the host to be able to pay what we're asking them in order to make a return for our members. We make an application to the distribution network operator, in other words, the national grid, and in this case through its subsidiary Electricity Northwest. And this will give us an indication of whether what we're proposing in this draft power purchase agreement is feasible. Sometimes the supply can be very limited and we have to retailor the scheme, redesign it. But hopefully in some cases there's spare capacity and we can go ahead with the project. If the host agrees the draft power purchase agreement, which includes a price for the unit of, in year one, the unit of electricity, we then look again at whether the scheme can be implemented in the state, in the design that it's been incorporated. The power purchase agreement will include a price for electricity that is purchased by the host, not necessarily all the electricity that's generated by the panels on the roof. But what we do ask is that spare electricity generated is allowed to be sold to the grid to make us some return on that. Obviously, the more that can be used in-house, the better, both for us and for the hosts, because that would mean that we can tailor the price down, and the larger the scheme, the better as well, because that gives a more economical project all round. The building has to be able to locate some extra electrical equipment, which in terms of an inverter and export and import meters. But if all things go well and the draft power purchase agreement is agreed, this gives a 20-year agreement where the hosts allow us to put the panels on the roof and for us to charge them for the electricity that they use. This price is index linked to the RPI, but on current estimates would be somewhere in the region of 12 to 20p per unit, which I think we will agree is much better than the sort of 50, 60 pence per unit that you're looking at from the big six. After 20 years, the panels would be gifted to the host. We would have paid for the whole installation of the panels. We would have paid for any repair and maintenance, and there should still be, but the panels usually have about a 25-year guarantee on them. So there should still be 5 to possibly more years useful life left in those panels, but we gift them to the host to do with as they wish. One word of caution before I hand back to Quentin. Anyone who approaches us expecting a quick turnaround is going to be disappointed. At the moment, solar contractors are absolutely snowed under with requests, and they themselves are struggling to source panels, which all seem to come from China now. So it would be from initial conception, it will be some months before we can envisage a scheme actually operating. But at least during the winter months that we have now, that would enable time to be well spent, sourcing a project and getting it to the design stage. I don't think there's anything else I can say at the moment. I'm bound to have missed out a lot of stuff. I hope there's a lot of questions that will enable me to fill in where the gaps are. There's an awful lot more detail, which it'd be impossible to go into in this short presentation, but I hope that's given you some idea of what Baywind's offer is. Essentially, it doesn't cost the host anything other than a relatively cheap price for electricity that they use on site. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hand back to Quentin and hopefully can answer any questions you have to raise.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. We'll come to the questions in a moment, if that's okay. I should, in the interest of fairness, say that other providers are available in addition to Baywind. Some of these, like Baywind, are set up as social enterprises, which means that they're not run primarily as profit-making businesses. Most of those are actually, like Baywind, member-owned cooperatives, which means that they're run in accordance with the principles of the cooperative movement. A couple of other examples for you, Solar for Schools and Schools Energy Co-op, both of which, as the name suggests, specialise in working with schools. There are providers that are not set up as social enterprises, but rather they're private businesses, and one example of those would be Autus Energy. Okay, time to hand over for questions. I've seen some questions in the chat and one so far in the question and answer box. So I'm going to start, Steve, by asking the question that's in the Q&A box and then have a look at the chat while you're answering. So There's a question here. How many terraced houses would that add up to? I think you mentioned, did you mention a 90, I'm not sure what the units, meter squared area?
Yeah, 90 to 100 square meters. A terrace house, when the FIT scheme started, you were looking at 4 kilowatts possibly on a terrace house. So I think you might just about get what is our minimum on 5 terrace houses if they're all linked together. The problem with that would be that you would have different supplies, different MPANs for each of those terraces probably. And that would mean that each scheme was individually only 4 kilowatts. And that would be a problem for us. The best way would be to combine the supplies. But as we're discovering in a scheme that we've got in progress in Barrow, that's a very, very difficult operation to achieve. But just to give you the rough idea, then in terms of actual area, you're looking at 5 terraces, yeah.
Just to add to that one, and I'm not going to be able to give as much detail as I'd like, but I saw a film at a community energy event last week in Ulverston about a scheme in one of the London boroughs where a community group is trying to get everyone in a terraced street to sign up to a community energy scheme with the aim of putting panels on everyone's roof. What I don't know is what model they're using. I don't think it's using a model like the Baywind model that Steve's just outlined. It may be that as a community, they're just trying to organise to get panels for each house individually with its own supply and its own sort of separate electrical connection and so on. So it's not quite the same thing. But Wendy, if that question came from you, if you email me, I might be able to find a link to that and send it to you in the next day or so. There's another question. So what happens if the roof needs to be repaired, Steve?
Yeah, well, ideally the roof needs to be in good condition when the scheme started, because these panels are going to be on hopefully for 25 years. If the roof needs repair within the middle, somewhere in the draft purchase agreement, there will be clauses relating to that. It's never actually happened to us yet, but my surmise would be that we would Baywind would fund the taking off of the panels to allow the roof to be repaired, presumably at the host's expense. We would pay also for the reinstatement of those panels, but we would ask for an extension on the 20-year agreement to enable us to recoup the costs of that and for the loss of income for the time that the panels weren't on.
Thanks, Steve. And linked to that in a way, who's responsible for getting planning permission at the outset if it's needed? Yeah,
unless it's a listed building or in some conservation areas, planning permission isn't needed. That's one of the beauties of rooftop solar. There is an upper threshold, but I think that's 30 kilowatt peak, I think, speaking off the top of my head. But for a 20 kilowatt scheme, certainly you wouldn't need planning permission.
Okay, thanks for that. And there's a next question is a topic which we've discussed previously, Steve. What about using solar tiles?
Yeah.
And linked to that, I suppose the other option to the solar tiles, which actually look like an old traditional roof tile, linked to that, I suppose the in-roof panels.
Yes. The problem with that is then you start to who owns the roof, essentially. With the scheme we've got, the host owns the roof and we, Baywind, own the panels. If you've got an integrated scheme, it becomes messy. We've never done one. There was a potential scheme in Workington that we were beginning to explore, but for one reason or another that fell through. I can't answer that. That would be something that we would have to discuss further in-house. Because there are certain liabilities and responsibilities that we just haven't considered yet, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question on community benefit from this. Do you have a community benefit fund? What happens to the money? If so, what's it spent on?
Yeah, well, Baywind originally had a community benefit fund, and that is manifested in the Baywind, I beg its pardon, Baywind Energy Community Trust, and that was funded by about £10,000 a year profit from the wind turbines going in to support local communities in terms of energy efficiency, LED lighting, insulation, that sort of thing. Since Baywind no longer operates the site, High Winds have taken that over, and I think they're putting even more into BWEC now. But Baywind itself doesn't have that. It if you like, outsources that to High Winds now.
Steve, am I right in thinking that the money that you get from the sale of electricity on these projects would be then reinvested in future community energy projects on other roofs? Is that the idea?
We return as much as we can to our members, Quentin.
Okay.
That was the point of the AGM decision, to continue using the money for electricity generation. There will be a small amount, I imagine, that could go into a community resource, but at the moment, the schemes that we have are so small, we just don't have that capacity. In fact, we're losing money at the moment.
Okay.
Because of COVID and all the rest of it.
Thanks. I'll just for the benefit of the people who don't know about the Burneside community energy model, it's a slightly different model in that in Burneside, a group came together for one scheme and one scheme only, really, and put panels on the roofs at James Cropper. In some ways, it was similar to the Baywind model in that it involved a power purchase agreement selling electricity to James Cropper at a discounted price. What Burneside Community Energy does with the money that it gets from James Cropper is, after paying its operating costs, and it does two things with the money. It pays its members, the shareholders, the investors, an interest payment in proportion to their holding at about 4-point-something%. It varies from year to year. And it also puts money into a community benefit fund in Burneside, which pays for local projects. And the biggest and most dramatic one it's done so far is that it paid to put panels on the roof of the local primary school. But it's a slightly different model in the sense that it just exists for that one scheme, really.
Yeah, okay, just to add to that, Quentin, were we to be able to start generating in a big way with some bigger schemes, I'm sure that would be something that we would wish to follow as well, giving a return to members. Yeah. But at the moment, we just don't have that capacity to be able to do a community benefit as well.
Okay, thanks. Another question, what happens at the end of the 25 years? Can the host continue to use the panels until they're no longer in good condition? Do they get removed? Is it up to the host to remove them?
Well, as I say, after 20 years, the duration of the PPA, they're gifted to the host and they can do what they like with them. Guarantee on panels is about 25 years, but there's a slight reduction in efficiency from that time, but you should really be able to get 30 years out of them. And it's entirely up to the host then to do with them as they wish.
Thanks. Another question, and I don't know if this falls within your area of expertise. The rates for exporting electricity to the grid, I guess, in most cases are quite poor. Am I right in thinking that you can use Octopus Agile Export whilst the host can use a standard tariff for import to increase your income if the demand doesn't meet the supply and power is needed to be exported? Do you discuss all of this with the host in terms of optimization of tariffs and negotiation of the smart export guarantee?
I confess I can't answer the second part of that. I can confirm that export rates are very low, which is why we're looking, when we develop schemes, that as much as possible is used by the host, and that enables us to then give a cheap rate, a discounted rate to the host. If it all has to go to export, then it becomes a much, much more expensive proposition for us, and it's unlikely that we would want to pursue the scheme. Export rate, I'm almost sure that export rates will go up, but probably not sufficiently to enable that to become a major source of our income, frankly.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, for anyone that doesn't know, when you generate electricity in a scheme such as this, you can use the electricity yourself or export it to the grid. The power companies pay you for the electricity that you export under a scheme called the Smart Export Guarantee. It won't surprise anyone to know that they pay you much less for each unit of electricity that you generate and send back to the grid than what you have to pay them when they generate electricity and you buy it off them. Interestingly, also, the rate, the tariff that they pay varies from company to company. So some of them pay a very low rate indeed, just a matter of a few pence per kilowatt hour, I think. And I think Octopus currently offers the best rate, which might be around about 7p a unit, something like that. The last time I looked, but they do vary, so don't quote me on that. Yes. So it pays you to shop around when you have a scheme like this. And also, just it's worth noting, and this applies to whether we're talking about a big scheme like this or a residential one, you don't have to sell electricity back to the grid via the same company that supplies your electricity. So you could buy your electricity, for example, off United Utilities, but you could sell it to the grid, maybe to Octopus if you found that gave a better rate. I think that's correct. I'd be happy to be corrected.
I can concur with that, Quentin. And there are obviously many energy companies that don't support export anyway. So if a scheme like ours was going to be implemented, and obviously you have to retain an electricity provider for those times when the solar panels can't produce. And if that provider doesn't support an export scheme, then you would have to look elsewhere. We would have to look elsewhere for selling the export.
Yeah, thanks. Just switching between chat and Q&A boxes. So I've missed a couple. Is this type of scheme suitable for modern buildings only, or have heritage buildings been used at all?
The problem with heritage buildings is planning permission. If you're talking listed buildings and in conservation areas, they don't tend to be keen on putting solar panels on the roofs. It might be possible to have a ground-based, a ground-mounted system, but that in itself lends itself to problems of shading. It's not as easy with heritage buildings, I have to admit.
I would just add to that at CAFS, we recently came across a case where a business in a conservation area was applying for planning permission to put panels on its roof, and was told by the local planning officer that they were likely to be turned down. There was a bit of correspondence then between various chief officers of various organisations and a local councillor. And as a consequence, but my colleague Molly might be able to clarify this, but as a consequence, I think the business was in the end given planning permission to install some panels, although not quite as many as they originally wanted to. So I think there may be a shift going on in terms of planning authorities' policy on whether they accept them in conservation areas.
That would be good to hear. That is good to hear, I should say, and it would be a vast improvement on the current situation.
Yeah. Another question below that: do panels help to protect the roof and make roof repair less likely?
Never been asked that one before. I suppose there's some benefit to them. You don't have the same hammer on the roof that you might have without the panels there. On the other hand, the panels are going to be putting some stress on the roof. So I think it's a mixed message, really. I think it would depend on the individual circumstances, quite honestly.
Okay. Another question. Is it a case of using the energy generated during daylight hours? Would there be much power on winter evenings, or what can you do about the winter issue or the nighttime issue, I suppose?
Yeah, well, the only solution is batteries. And up to date, batteries have been so expensive, relatively speaking, that certainly in Baywind, we haven't considered them. But with all the technology that's going into electric cars and that, batteries are becoming cheaper now and technologically more efficient. So Baywind is going to be looking at batteries in a bigger way now, and that would make substantial difference to some of the schemes we have, I think.
Yeah, I would just add to that, thinking about the friends I know who have panels on their roofs. A number of them have got batteries, but I think they'd probably all describe themselves as enthusiasts. So it wasn't based purely on a sort of financial business case. They just wanted to reduce their emissions by getting more use from the electricity they generated, and sort of saving it in a battery and using it in the evening. But I think for them, it was based on a huge amount of passion to reduce their carbon footprint.
Yeah,
similarly, sorry, Steve.
Just complimenting that, much as we would like to be enthusiastic, we do have a mandate to consider our shareholders, and until batteries become a realistic proposition, we're not going to be looking at them too seriously.
I would just add to that. I did a site visit to a village hall in the north of the county, Skelton and Toppin Memorial Hall, near Greystoke, near Penrith. they have got quite a large solar installation now on their roof as of a few months ago, and are installing a fair amount of battery capacity, but they were in the fortunate position of being able to raise the capital from a variety of grant sources. So in a sense, they didn't quite have to worry about the same sort of business case and financial considerations, because they got the capital funding from other sources. Question about any issues with the Lake District National Park. I think we've sort of discussed that a bit. How long is the price of electricity fixed for the host? How does that work?
The initial draft power purchase agreement would give the year one price, and then that's index linked through RPI throughout the 20 years. And we don't ask for anything other than the contingency, for instance, where we have to take the panels off. We wouldn't alter that. And that would be fixed throughout the 20-year period.
Thanks. Colleague Molly has given a bit more clarification on the example of the business I gave. Apparently, they had to move the panels from the roof that was clearly visible from the road, which is why they ended up with a smaller installation. So perhaps not quite as much progress as I'd hoped for there in terms of planning permission.
No, don't hold your breath on that one, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay. Another question: is there noticeably less electricity exported if you have battery storage?
I can't answer that because we don't have any battery storage at the moment. I mean,
I guess that would be the case. For those of you who haven't seen it, there's a fascinating video on a website of an organisation called PACT, P-A-C-T, which is Penrith Action for Community Transition. And one of their members, Richard Waller, has put up a webinar in which he explains what he's done in his home. And he's got quite a sophisticated system with different components of his system talking to each other through various bits of smart technology. So he has got battery storage, and he's also got thermal storage in the form of a sort of a modern version of the old-fashioned hot water cylinder. And by using those two storage facilities, he's able to get much better use out of the electricity that he generates on his roof, and therefore does end up exporting less electricity back to the grid than you'd otherwise do. So I hope that partially answers that question.
And any reduction in the amount that is exported and is used on site in some fashion or other has got to be a good thing.
And just to add to that, I think that Richard is also in the position where his system is sophisticated enough that he can charge his battery from the mains. He's on one of these flexible, agile, real-time tariffs. So when electricity is very cheap at night, he sometimes tops up his battery, and then when he can get a better rate by selling it back to the grid, he exports it back to the grid, I think, at a better rate. So it's quite a sophisticated system. And I guess the world is moving more towards that. But it's not necessarily an easy thing to set up. We've got a few minutes left. I'm just looking to see if there are any more questions. If I have missed your question, anybody, please feel free to type it in again. If I perhaps scrolled past it. There's an example from Molly. An example from a homeowner is that on-site usage rises from about 30% to 70% if you include a battery in your setup. However, for other building types, it will depend upon the electricity being consumed. Yeah. That makes sense, because if you think about it, a lot of us, well, slightly different these days when so many people work from home, but in general, in the old-fashioned sense, people used to go out during the daytime and come home and use electricity in their homes more in the evening. And I guess that's where the majority of electricity still is used. But in a lot of businesses, it's the opposite case. There's business electricity being used during the daytime, which more or less corresponds with daylight hours.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we draw to a close? Let's see if any more questions pop up. Right. In that case, that pretty much brings us to the end of the webinar. One more thing I want to do, and that is to post a poll to see how many of you are interested in this kind of approach to installing solar panels. So I'm going to post that poll now and launch it. And when you see this, if you could click on yes, no, maybe, or not applicable, I'm just here to learn about it. If you could do that and see what the responses are. So feel free to indicate your level of interest. And I'm hoping that you can see the results as they come up. So at the moment, I'm looking at about between 20 and 30% of people who are interested in this, 45% of saying maybe, 30% hear more to learn about it. Looks like we've got, I think, most, still one or two coming in. Okay, so we've ended up with 20% say yes, interested, 0 say no, not interested, 40% say maybe interested, and 40% say I'm just here to learn about, which is quite interesting. Let me share the results.
Yeah.
Right, so you should be able to see that. Okay, good. Right, thank you. So final comments. If you'd like to find out more about community energy or about how Baywind could help you, please feel free to email me, and I'll just click on to the next slide just to remind you of email addresses. Or alternatively, if you want to contact Steve directly at Baywind, it's got his email address on there too. We will email you all in the next week or so with a copy of today's presentation and a link to a recording of the webinar on the CAF's YouTube channel. Finally, I'd like to thank Steve for being with us today. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you.
And most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. It's been really great. So thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.